Have you ever had a dream that seemed all too real? The type that makes you wake up and wonder, was I really dreaming? If we took it one step further, have you ever experienced the phenomenon of sleep paralysis, where you are awake but unable to move? People have been known to experience hallucinations, visions, even feelings in this state that feel far too real not to have happened. Well, our story today will make that seem like child's play. This is the story of a man named Sherman Sizemore and the horrible ordeal he had to go through, experiencing things we couldn't even begin to imagine. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back further. For most of his adult life, he worked in one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. He was a coal miner who had come face to face with death more times than he can count. Between mineshaft collapses or gas leaks, it was a miracle he was even alive. After his kids all grew up, however, he became an ordained Baptist minister, who despite his backstory and rugged appearance, was mostly known for being kind and gentle. That was until January 2006. In what felt like an instant, Sherman had gone from the rock of nearly unshakable stability to being a paranoid-stricken psycho who go on to make insane claims, having random outbursts, and nearly pushing his wife to... But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start from the beginning. On the afternoon of January 19, Sherman and his lovely wife, Ruby, sit down watching television. Suddenly, Sherman lets out a blood-curdling scream, staring at something that horrified him. The scream was so horrifying and spontaneous that his wife began screaming right along with him. She stared at him, trying to understand what is going on. But as she stared at the spot that Sherman was, she saw exactly what he was looking at. Nothing. There's nothing there. That only made it worse, as Ruby tried to reach out to him to find out what's going on. Why was he suddenly in so much terror, but then he just stopped. It was as if whatever he was seeing has paralyzed him in pure fear. His stare was deadlocked, with his eyes wide, mouth open, but no movement, as whatever brought this on kept him in this terrified state. Ruby starts to panic, trying to figure out what was going on. Why was her husband doing this? Eventually, the only thing she could do is cling on to him and beg desperately for him to come back to her. Come back to her, please. He would, and the next thing he would say would be even stranger. He turns to her and says, "You can't leave, or they'll kill me." This was like nothing the couple had been through, ever. This wasn't even the same man that she had known for years. Something fundamental must have broken to cause such a drastic change. She has no idea what to do. She could only try to support him as best as possible, hoping this would stop, but it wouldn't. For the remainder of the day, Sherman would break out in these episodes, screaming at something that Ruby couldn't see, but it was clear that Sherman was. Of course, she thought of calling the police, but she was so used to him being such an unshakable rock, this beacon of hope, that she thought he would bounce back, just like he always does. All they needed to do was get through the night and it would be fine. Hopefully. The next morning, however, Sherman hadn't slept. He was staring at the ceiling, looking even worse than the day before, and so Ruby would decide to call the family to try and sort it out together. Strangely, Sherman would hear of this, and the paranoia extended to them as well. He let her know that they can't come inside because he was afraid that there were people, including his own family, conspiring to bury him alive. This behavior was odd for a man who was so competent and stable to do such a complete 180. There had to be a reason, right? For that reason, we go back a few months before that day of January 19th. Sherman had complained of severe abdominal pains and sought medical attention. The doctor would determine that most likely the pain may have been coming from his gallbladder, but the only way they could really tell is if they did explorative surgery, meaning opening him up and looking inside to see if there was anything wrong. The doctor asked him what he'd like to do. He could go along with this surgery or just wait it out and see if the situation improves. After talking it over with his family, he decides to go ahead with it because the pain was simply too much. That leads us to the morning of January 19th, when Sherman would go in for a routine surgery, the same day that he snapped. Sherman is prepped and then brought into the operating room. An oxygen mask is lowered by a nurse. The IV is stuck in his arm so that the anesthesiologist could begin to administer the cocktail of drugs meant to put him to sleep. This is called general anesthesia. He would be out cold and they could operate without hindrance. For this, 2 drugs are needed. One that paralyzes you in order to stop you from making any involuntary motion, and the other takes away the pain and puts you to sleep. In a mistake, Sherman would only be given one of these drugs. He's told to count back from 10. Having been in surgery before, he knew he'd be out well before 10. He happily began to count down in his head and reach his 1, but he's still awake. Not just awake, he could completely feel his body, but was unable to move. He would try to scream, but even his vocal cords were paralyzed. He tries to calm down because maybe they're slow acting. He'll be fine and out well before the surgery actually begins. Then he did the only thing that he could in that state, which was flick his eyes from left to right as fast as he could, but his eyes were taped shut. The constant flicking would create a small opening that he could see through. The surgeon had his gloves on and was ready to begin surgery, while Sherman was still fully able to feel his body. Then he hears a single word that would truly start out Sherman's living nightmare. He hears scalpel, and with that, the doctor begins cutting deep into Sherman's midsection. There he would lay motionless, only able to move his eyes left and right. Unfortunately, no one would see him. The surgeon continues to cut out a significantly sized hole until he hands the scalpel back to the nurse and says, "The clamps," and these were used to stretch and pin segments of his skin in order to keep the skin in place. Then he would tug and stretch at the opening in order to make sure he had enough space to see inside of Sherman's body. Could only imagine the amount of pain. Even the slightest tug would send waves coursing through Sherman's nerves. The surgeon would then call out for a scope, which would be a tiny camera that they would jam into the open cavity, and then he would call out suction, which would be a vacuum-like device to remove fluid from the body. Then there would be the height of Sherman's nightmare. He would hear forceps, and they would use this device to dislodge the gallbladder from his body in order to get a better look at it. By now Sherman would no longer be in the same panic state. He was no longer flicking his eyes. All he could do is stare on as they continued the surgery, internally screaming, hoping someone would see him. Anyone would look up and see that he is awake. And someone did. One of the nurses would look down at Sherman's face to see his terror-filled eyes staring back at her. She screams, "Stop, stop, he's awake." The surgeon yells out to the anesthesiologist to get over here and fix it. Finally, he'll be pumped full of the painkillers. It was in that moment that he realized he did not administer the second drug necessary for him to pass out. Now the team would realize that this means that they have a very big problem on their hands. A patient sitting on their operating table went through 16 minutes, 16 whole minutes of surgery while he was fully awake and aware. There is no chance that when he wakes up, the hospital would not be sued. So a decision was made. Whether the surgeon was aware of it or the anesthesiologist worked alone, we do not know. But he was given an additional drug, midazolam, better known as the amnesia drug, and it was true to the name. Whoever took this drug would have no memory of what happened to them. And the obvious thought behind this was, if he doesn't remember, he can't sue. This would have worked perfectly. Sherman was operated on, brought to the recovery room, and woke up not remembering what happened. Not in his conscious mind at least, but it said that the subconscious mind never forgets. The trauma he had encountered left feelings of dread permanently tattooed on the walls of his mind, but now he had nothing to connect it to. A severe state of fear with nothing immediate to attach it to. Does that sound familiar? With this, he woke up with a feeling of anxiety looming over him. He would leave the hospital that day on January 19th, and over the next few hours, the feelings would build and build until he eventually reached a breaking point and snapped. Over the next few days following the 19th, he would get worse, eventually accessing memories of the 16 minutes he suffered through. But even then, he wouldn't have thought this happened to me. He would be stuck in this living nightmare thinking he was going mad. The family tried to get doctors, psychologists, and therapists involved to try and piece this puzzle together. But before they could, Sherman would have reached his limit, and 2 weeks after the surgery, on February 2nd, he had taken his own life. The family was devastated, left with no answers as to why this had happened, why such a bright flame became so dim, and eventually, snuffed out. They would continue to dig and dig until they finally get their hands on the medical report of the gallbladder surgery on the morning of January 19. It stated that Sherman did in fact experience 16 minutes of anesthesia awareness, where you are awake and actually feel a portion of your surgery. And this is more common than you might think. However, Sherman's case, where someone actually experiences 16 minutes of intense surgery, that was completely rare. The family went on to sue the hospital and was awarded an undisclosed amount in 2008.